Good evening. Hi there. My name's Andrew Woods. I'm Senior Curator at the Yorkshire Museum. And some years ago, I worked with the PAS in Suffolk and also at the Fitzwilliam Museum. And it's really my time in those places that I'll be talking about this evening with these wonderful coins from Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. Now, the slightly strange nature of things this evening is that I have to be out of the country today, somewhat unexpectedly for work. I'm accompanying a courier, couriering some objects overseas. Covering for a colleague in doing so, and as such you've got a pre-record of me rather than being live. I'm actually recording this last week sometime. Apologies for that, and thank you very much to the committee for being helpful at running with this alternative way of things. I'm hoping that this format will work out nonetheless. It's slightly new for me, so forgive me if I push the wrong button every now and then. So then, this evening I'm going to be speaking about the coinage of Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. But before I begin, I'll say that I've been very fortunate enough to work with these coins for well over a decade now, identifying when they were first found through to analysis today. And I can say that they are comfortably the most exciting group of coins I've ever had the privilege of working with. And I hope that I'm going to be able to share some of the insights and indeed, I guess, some of the excitement that I've had from these coins with you all this evening. So then, my talk today. I'm going to briefly outline the background to the Landscape and Lordship project through which the analysis of these coinages is undertaken, and to the archaeology of Rendlesham more generally. And I will stress that I'm very much not the expert nor leading that project here. My focus during that project was very much upon the coinage, which will really be the second half of my talk, I suppose. In that part, I will introduce the coins, the data, think about the research questions and the methods that I've used in their analysis. But really the meat of my talk today will be looking at the coinage from Rendlesham itself, and particularly think about how it compares to East Anglia through time, really from the late 6th through to about the mid 7th century. And the last thing I'll try to do is towards the end draw some conclusions. How do we pull all of this together? And inevitably in a talk like this, I won't be able to do justice to everything, but I'll do my very best to give you a sense of where my thinking is with this coinage at this moment in time. So then, why am I talking to you about Rendlesham, or why should you be interested in Rendlesham? Well, Rendlesham is identified in Bede's history in the way that you see on the screen here. Bede was writing at a later point in the 8th century, but is describing events from the middle part of the 7th century. And he describes Rendlesham as a royal settlement, a vicus regius. Exactly what that means, I guess, is the kind of the core of many of the questions, but that's how it's described in Bede. And that description tallies with the archaeology of South East Suffolk, where there are elite burials at nearby Sutton Hoo and Snape. A kind of major international port at Ipswich emerges alongside the proposed central place at Rendlesham. And this area can be seen as a core area for royal power in East Anglia at about the time that Bede was writing. For those unfamiliar with the geography of Suffolk, the red circle on the map here indicates where Rendlesham is. Although I'm sure you know, excuse me, it's 6 kilometres up the Devon River Valley from Sutton Hoo and a relatively short distance to the northeast of Ipswich. And if I get my little laser pointer, it's this little black square in the centre of that circle there. And the site began to produce a hugely interesting set of metal detector finds about 15 years ago. And the detectorists worked with Suffolk County Council Archaeology Service to record and investigate the site. And I guess I was very fortunate. I was doing some voluntary work during my PhD in Bury St Edmunds at the time, and on early medieval coinage. And so the offer was, would you like to have a look at these for us? And frankly, I bit their hand off, although I didn't realise quite how many there were at the time. And now, nearly 15 years later, I'm still looking at these coins, learning new things and analysing them. This is a site that continues to give to us to this day. So the site, those objects became part of a very large recording project lasting between 2008 and 2017. And the 4 detectorists named on the screen here, Rob, Roy, Terry and Alan, undertook a vast amount of systematic detecting. They recorded all of their finds with very accurate grid spots, recorded which fields they were in and how often they had searched there. And really the project, my analysis and all part of the Landscape and Lordship project in general, wouldn't have been possible without their work, and indeed the work of many, many others who volunteered their time during the course of things. And so we're enormously thankful for that. And some of those who we should be thanking are named here, and I'm not going to read them all out, but in particular we should acknowledge the support of the landowners, Sir Michael and Lady Bunbury, and really central to the whole project are those 4 detectorists who covered every inch of over 180 hectares over the course of the survey. But there's a whole load of institutional support here as well for the project and for the recording. It really is. The best projects are rarely the product of one person or one organisation. They are always at their best when people work in collaboration, and this is really very much a collaborative project. And so this fieldwork that had been undertaken over quite a number of years generated a vast amount of archaeological data. And luckily enough, we were able to get a 3-year project grant from the Human Trust that funded an expert team, those are listed on the screen here, to study the Rendlesham material and to set the site into its broader context. And this Landscape and Lordship project is finished at the moment. The book will be out later this year, published by the Society of Antiquaries, and I would encourage you to keep an eye out for it because it really will be a fantastic thing. And there's been a subsequent project to this called Rendlesham Revealed. You may have heard a bit about that, which has undertaken fairly large-scale excavations over the last 3 or 4 summers. My results of my analysis today won't take account of anything from Rendlesham Revealed. Really, the book Lordship and Landscape is all of the results up to 2020. Although I think it'd be fair to say that nothing that has been uncovered since then would radically rewrite the interpretation of the coinage, at least. I had to stop collecting data at some point, otherwise this could go on forever. So the results and the analysis I'll talk to you about will be of the data up to 2020. And I should say that there's a list of people on here, 10 or 12. My work is on the coinage, but I've really benefited enormously from the advice and expertise of others within other fields. And actually, again, I would emphasize that one of the joys of this project is it has been genuinely collaborative, and that's yielded quite an interesting set of results, I think. So then, I'm going to try and briefly summarise the archaeological approach and give you a sense of Rendlesham before moving on to the coinage specifically. And I will emphasise enormously that this is not my area of expertise. This is work that's been undertaken by others, really. So there was field walking and some small-scale excavation at Rendlesham in the early 1980s, which identified early medieval activity. But the extent and character of the settlement was probably still a little bit uncertain at that point. But it's essentially been confirmed between 2008 and 2017 as the extent and character of that settlement recorded by Bede is broadly accurate. And it's been confirmed by a combination of systematic metal detecting, magnetometry, aerial photography interpretation, and some trial excavation. And this is a map of Rendlesham. Just to kind of give you a sense of scale, this is the river that runs up the west side of our site here, with an inlet through here. All of the pink areas are those which were part of the metal detector survey, and the little dots represent finds of 5th to 8th century material, just over 1,200 of them. The pink area is a survey area of nearly 180 hectares. And most of the excavation where it has occurred is focused in these fields right at the heart of the site here. Right at the heart of the site here and here. The main area of the finds distribution, so sort of zooming in onto the centre of this, was surveyed by magnetometry to check for archaeological buried features. It revealed quite a lot of things, but particularly many sunken featured buildings. Lots of those were found, which are the sort of black anomalies that you can see dotted around on this mag data here. And this was some targeted trenching to test those geophysics results. So this is before Rendlesham Revealed, this is a few years ago now, found we opened quite small trenches and found the features which aligned with what the geophysics was telling us, basically. This was ground truthing those geophysics results. And the work of analysing what those objects are, their distribution, comparing them to the geophysics, and which has been ground truth with those small amounts of excavations, has led to a kind of working model for Rendlesham, which is that which you see on here. And there is a lot more detail about everything I've just told you in the book, but this is just by way of summary, that this is a regional elite royal site, which is one of the largest and richest sites known from contemporary England. That it was a farm, a residence, and likely a tribute centre, that it sat at the apex of society and sat at the centre of networks of exchange and redistribution. And that, I guess, even without the bead reference, that we would still be interpreting it as looking like a site that sits right at the very top of 7th century society. In terms of the kind of geography of the place, we have a sense that there's a permanent set of residents here and permanent settlement here and here around this kind of watery inlet. But that in this kind of wider landscape immediately around those settlement areas, there's a sort of a real smear of metal detector finds that suggests perhaps periodic gatherings, lots of tents, quite ephemeral features conceivably, but which leave quite a lot of material culture scattered around the area. And so we're kind of envisaging that there is a king in residence from time to time, if you can imagine peripatetic kingship, and that for some of that time there is then a wider number of retinues, and then for perhaps even less frequently, even larger periodic gatherings with lots of tents and kind of lots of interesting economic activity. So then, that is an 8-minute summary of 15 years worth of research, 150,000 words worth of book that will emerge later this year, 4K of research, 4 years worth of research rather. And I would say that when the book emerges later this year, please do check it out. It will do it justice in a way that I cannot possibly do so by way of 10-minute introduction. What I would like to do is turn to the coinage, and that's really where the focus of the rest of my talk is today, and really where my expertise lies. Within our Landscape and Lordship project, we posed a number of research questions, and they're on the screen before you. So the first of which was, to what extent was Rendlesham a uniquely sophisticated site when compared to others in the region? The second is, what were the networks of exchange? And the third is, how did coin use at elite places such as Rendlesham shape the development and monetization, the use of money across the landscape more widely? With the latter two questions in particular, the implicit element to them is, how did things change through time? And rather than trying to trace all of the networks from a kind of monolithic block of early medieval period, I'm going to try and trace how they change through time and what that can tell us, I suppose. There were other research questions, but these are the ones that the coinage was particularly suited to address. So then, to try and answer these questions, I approached the analysis of the coinage at 3 scales. First of which was to look at the distribution of material at Rendlesham itself. Where is the coinage from? What types? What dates? Whereabouts on the site? How does it compare to other material culture proxies for things like metalworking, burial, other types of activity and the like? There are 282 early medieval coins from Rendlesham, of which 272 are from the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries. This number of finds is pretty much unparalleled anywhere else in England. We've also, as part of the Lordship and Landscape project, assembled comparative data sets for a number of other sites within the region. So geographically, these are those close to Rendlesham, at Codnam, Barham and Ipswich, in southern Suffolk, so down here. And then we've also got those further north at Hoxton here, Caister, and Burnham up on near the Norfolk coast. And these sites were selected as others with potential for being high status and thus comparable to Rendlesham. And these combined sites total another 342 coins. None have the same number of coins as Rendlesham, but we can compare relative proportions, dates and types nonetheless, rather than absolute numbers. And I also looked at things at a landscape or kind of regional level, drawing together the data for all of the coin finds between 500 and 800 from East Anglia. And that data set draws on the Port of Antiquity scheme, but also the Fitzwilliam Museum's corpus of early medieval coin finds and the Norfolk and Suffolk HER data. And the total number of coins there is 1,404. And the spatial data associated with most of those coins isn't great. So I always have a parish level, but not really anything more fine-grained than that. And so I've grouped them into their parishes, essentially, for that landscape analysis. And I'm going to approach the analysis today by dividing things up chronologically. And in doing so, I'm going to attempt to trace the changes in networks of exchange through time. The broad periods are those laid out on the screen here. I've omitted the circa from the dates, but please do remember that precise dating of coinage is incredibly difficult. You know, things could be out by 5 or 10 years in either direction relatively easily here. The periods that I will speak about reflect the changes in the form and material of the coinage. So in that first period between 550 and 630, all of the coinage which circulated in East Anglia was from the continent, mostly from Francia, and it was struck using quite a high standard of gold. Most of those coins will be at least 50% gold, all the way up to about 90%. In the middle years of the 7th century, so between 630 and 670-ish, continental gold coins, the tremeces from Francia and the like, continued to circulate in East Anglia, but also locally struck English coins were circulating as well. And both sets of these coins were struck to a slightly lower standard of gold, usually less than 50% fine, some all the way down to about 10% gold, with the rest silver. From about 670 or so, silver coins were struck and used very widely across East Anglia and indeed around the North Sea. These are the silver early pennies. You may have heard them called shatters or skeets in the past. I'm going to use early penny or just coin. And there's very large numbers of these known. And then from about 730 or so, these coins were in turn debased themselves, with the silver gradually reduced and copper alloy content of these coinage increased dramatically. Some were as low as 10 or 15% silver by about 750 or so. And these physical changes in the coinage mean that we've got a kind of a chronology that we can work to for the production and use of these coins. And I'm going to break things down by these 4 groups or by these 4 periods for much of my analysis today. So to begin, and I guess it makes sense to begin at the very beginning, which is the earliest the earliest coinage to circulate at Rendlesham and indeed in East Anglia in the early medieval period are pseudo-imperial gold coins. And these are coins which were struck in Visigothic Spain and parts of and the southern parts of modern-day France during the 6th century. And they imitate the imperial coinage of the Byzantine Empire. And you may just be able to see you've got the kind of, if you've seen many Roman coins, you're looking at ultimately things that are deriving from there. So you have the diadem that runs through the hair that you would see on many late Roman coins, and the drapery of the bust here, and a kind of winged victory figure on the reverse of this one over here, and a Byzantine cross here on the reverse of this one. There are 5 of these pseudo-imperial gold coins from Rendlesham, and they are likely to be the earliest coins used and lost at the site. And the distribution of those coins is here on the right-hand side of the screen. And the only other site in East Anglia where more than one of these has been found is at nearby Coddenham. So this is Rendlesham here, and then the other site is Coddenham here. And the distribution of most of the rest of the coins of such an early date, so these are really maybe 550 to 580-ish or so, is overwhelmingly coastal. You have a sort of a distribution that stretches around the Norfolk coast here with a series of finds, only one inland here. So yes, so it's the only concentrations of them are at Rendlesham and at Coddenham. Another type of early medieval coin from Rendlesham are Byzantine bronze coins, as you can see on the screen here. These have the imperial portrait, and you may just be able to make out a facing figure here. So face in the center, crown here, holding an orb with a cross on the top here, looking at you. And there are and the reverse types give a sense of their denomination. So you have M or XXX on the M on the coin at the bottom and XXX on the top. There are 8 of these coins from Rendlesham. The earliest comes from the reign of Justin II in the 560s, and the latest is from the 620s in the reign of Heraclius, with March Tiberius and Phocas, those 2 coins on the screen, in between them. There are very few other Byzantine coins in East Anglia, and they show a clustering in southeast Suffolk, which is the distribution map you see on the right here. Even at the study sites, which are pretty high status, or in most cases, there really is little evidence for the presence of Byzantine coinage. And indeed, in this kind of early period, with this kind of gold coming from overseas and bronze coming from overseas, it really has a largely coastal distribution, with only the sites at Rendlesham and Coddenham being those where multiple coins of this type have been found. Circulating alongside that Byzantine coinage in the period after 580, there were gold coins from the Merovingian Frankish kingdoms. There are 25 such coins from Rendlesham and 50 for the rest of East Anglia combined. And they were struck at mints right across modern France, hundreds of them. There are vast numbers of mints in France. The coins are quite difficult to analyse. There are some challenges of attribution, and it can be difficult to discern exactly which mint and also exactly what date coins are. The figure on the right, which is the map, shows little black dots where I've been able to pin down exactly which mint coins are from in Rendlesham, and the bigger the black dot, the more coins are from that mint. So most mints are only represented by a single coin, some have got a small handful. And for the project, we've used their gold fineness as a proxy for their date. This is an imprecise method, but it's helpful for showing some general patterns. And really the idea is that the earlier the coin is, the finer it is in very broad terms. And we've been able to analyse the fineness of a number of gold coins and those with the high gold content are likely to be the earliest. The red circles on the map here represent the mints where the coins with high gold fineness, i.e. the early ones, are likely to have originated. And they have a western distribution. So you can see here coming in the river valleys and up this way, and really down the west coast of Francia. And this would suggest that in the late 6th and early part of the 7th century, that there was a network exchange, which Rendlesham was a part of, which extended down the west coast of France and beyond. And the Byzantine coins suggest that there was likely to be fairly direct contact with those in the Mediterranean world beyond. This connection with regions well versed in the use of coinage and its symbolic and administrative potential is likely to have played a role in the early adoption of coinage at Rendlesham. So what about when they arrived? And this is a plot of the Rendlesham study area with the coloured squares showing where coins have been found from this early period. And sorry, this isn't quite as nice a map as the other one, but for orientation, this is the kind of the main settlement area, another bit of settlement over here, and then this is the inlet of water running through the centre. And as I've said, the project's been able to define different areas, so you've got kind of a fair number of coins from this area of kind of permanent elite settlement, evidence for graves and settlement over here, again with coin finds, and then kind of the scatter of coin finds extends right out into that area of sporadic or seasonally occupied areas to the north and south. And I've spent quite a long time analysing these distributions with reference to these. Are certain areas earlier than others? Are there different types or origins in different parts of this site? And I'm sad to say it because it took me a very long time to figure this out, but the long and short of it is no. There are no discernible differences. There are early coins from the fields over here to the east and up on the kind of promontory here. Really, there isn't any kind of discernible pattern here. And I think this is interesting as there are coins from the areas which we are interpreting as permanently occupied, as well as from the seasonal area. And any model which kind of suggests coinage started in one area of Rendlesham and then kind of gradually expanded outwards to others just isn't correct. When coinage was first used at Rendlesham, it was used across almost all of this site. And I would suggest that kind of periodic assemblies with some attendees from overseas conceivably are the likely context for most of this coin use and coin loss. Those attending used coinage at Rendlesham, but not seem to be many other places, as there is a real marked contrast between spatially widespread use of coinage at Codnham and at Rendlesham and the rest of the East Anglian landscape, where coinage of this period is frankly exceptionally rare. This suggests that the circulation of these coins was probably socially restricted, and their occurrence at a handful of places at the very apex of the settlement hierarchy is evidence for elite or royal connections. Coin use was associated with a restricted range of activities transacted within elite social spheres and at special places, and likely to be focused on the regional rulers, their kindred and clients, I would suggest, at this early point in time. In the middle decades of the 7th century, the networks of exchange at Rendlesham shifted significantly. If you break down the origins of coinage that's coming in from Merovingian Francia, again by fineness, which is what you have on the right here, the blue kind of representing kind of mid-fineness, 50 to 80%, so not quite as fine or as early as the ones I've just shown you, and then the yellow circles representing the late coins where fineness is less than 50% and sometimes all the way down to 10%. And if you break the coinage down in here in this way, it becomes clear that the coins used at Rendlesham were produced at mints which were gradually more northern and eastern within Francia. A western route for the arrival of coinage into Francia gradually gave way to networks of exchange that by about 650-ish were centred on the southern part of the North Sea, not the western coast of France. Indeed, the mint at Quentovic in northern France was producing a sizable minority of the coinage in circulation in East Anglia and at Rendlesham. And I would kind of describe this as something of a localising trajectory. As coinage gradually became more plentiful at Rendlesham and indeed across East Anglia, it also travelled shorter distances to get there. It's also in these middle years of the 7th century that coin use became gradually more widespread. On the right is a map of the Deben and Gipping river valleys with 7th century coin finds plotted. In both cases, there was a single site, Rendlesham in the Deben and Codnham in the Gipping Valley, with evidence for early coins, so those that really are from the late 6th or very early part of the 7th century. In the mid-7th century, coin use gradually expanded outwards to a small number of sites in the immediate vicinity. So this is Rendlesham here, and then we have kind of coin use, a series of sites not too far away in Ike and Ufford in particular, and at Codnham, stretching slightly further south to Barham and Akenham. And it's in this mid-7th century period that coin use gradually expanded outwards to a number of sites, other than just those two primary ones. And I would argue that its coin use was no longer entirely focused on one or two elite sites, but also occurred at others in their immediate vicinity, and that probably tells us something about the nature of coin use in those areas as well. The nature of what it was being used for in those places as well. And the emerging coin use is also visible when viewed across all of East Anglia. So where the earliest coins have been clustered in coastal areas and a few inland sites, by the middle years of the 7th century, coin use had become much more widespread, penetrating into a variety of inland areas. And that's what the little black dots on the map here are. And this is a relative risk map of that, with the kind of yellow areas highlighting where there are more of these coin finds. Here I would continue to suggest that the focus of coin use in East Anglia in the period to about 670 or so is very much the southeastern part of Suffolk. It's this kind of smear of yellow here. This is really where coin use is being used in Suffolk in particular. And this area encompasses Codnham, Rendlesham, but also finds to their north along the Dove Valley and around Hoxton. And at this moment in time, there are relatively fewer finds from Norfolk. What was this coinage being used for? Well, in addition to its use in kind of official and commercial transactions, coinage also had a significance within the social sphere. There are 3 coins with loops added. So here you can see in this coinage in the top right, there's been a loop added to this coin to turn it into a pendant. And these loops are on coins which are broadly from the early part of the gold coinage chronology. That seems to be the way of, if you're turning coins into jewellery in the early part of the Rendlesham chronology, you're using loops. And there are 2 coins that have been pierced for suspension, which look like this. And these are from the later part of that gold coinage chronology, from the middle part of the 7th century. And I think it's quite interesting that when we look at the positioning of the piercing and loops, suggests that in the early part of the period, they're interested in orienting the front of the coin, the obverse, in the vertical plane, whilst in the middle part of the 7th century, they're interested in the reverse, usually the side with the cross on it. And I think there might be something interesting in that, although the fact that I've only got 5 coins means I can't be too certain about it. That being said, that most coins are unaltered, suggesting that there is likely an economic usage for the vast majority of coinage used and lost at Rendlesham. That being said, these handful of coins demonstrate the interrelationship between gold as currency and its use in social context as a display jewellery, as a piece of display jewellery. From the middle part of the 7th century onwards, as the medium was transformed from gold to silver, the symbolic function of coinage fundamentally shifted. There's very, very little evidence for the use of coinage in display in this manner in later periods, really from the middle part of the 7th century onwards. At Rendlesham, coinage was being used within or alongside a metal weight mentality. And we know that coinage was used as bullion at times, which has been left evidence in the form of fragmented and adjusted coinages. Gold coins all have a weight which clusters between 1.2 and 1.3 grams. There are also 2 blanks at the site, which are that look like this. So coins, lumps of gold that have been hammered flat and in the size and weight of a coin, but have never been stamped. And the fact that you're getting both blanks and coins is quite strongly suggestive to me of a weight standard for these gold coins. And we can see that in that 2 of our coins have been adjusted. So this is a lightweight coin, which has had a piece of another coin added to it, which brings it up to the weight standard, brings it back up to 1.3 grams. Coins are being weighed out, and we know that because we also have the weights. So coins are placed on a balance with a weight on one side and coin on the other, and we have the coin weights marked with an N for nomisma, and these are kind of Byzantine standards here. The things that we see at Rendlesham, the evidence for the adjustment of coins, for the weighing of coin, and indeed for the cutting of coin, like the one you see here in the middle, shouldn't come as a surprise to us. We can see similar things in the Sutton Hoo coin, which consists of coins, blanks, 2 ingots, and coins with an average weight of 1.3 grams. The bullion elements and coins of a specific weight standard suggest a metal weight mentality like that seen at contemporary Rendlesham. These are likely the same people approaching their currency in the same sort of way. Aligning chronologically with the expanding use of coinage from about 630-ish was also an expansion in its use in its production. Adrian Marsden and Gareth Williams have both suggested that East Anglia struck coinage in this pale gold period, and I would absolutely agree with that. Certain types, including those that you see on the screen here, appear very likely to have been struck in East Anglia, and more specifically than that, I would argue they're likely to have been made in southeastern Suffolk. If we look at a distribution of where all of these East Anglian types are coming from, it is overwhelmingly found at Coddenham, Rendlesham, and in this sort of southeastern Suffolk area. This is the area that was at the centre of coin use, and it's also where East Anglian English coin finds are focused. So yes, I think they're being used and made in this in southeastern Suffolk, essentially. So yes, so if forgive me, this type here, the gold shilling, is very likely to have been made at Coddenham, where you can see the kind of center of the distribution map. Although there is a slightly wider distribution for some of the other types, we can be reasonably confident that the elite sites in southeastern Suffolk, Hoxton, Coddenham and Rendlesham, were the sites where some of these coins were produced. I'm not going to call them mints because that would imply that there's a sort of building in which they happen in. It's much more likely to be slightly more fluid than that, but I think it very likely that it is those elite sites in southeastern Suffolk where these coins are being made. And there is quite a narrow distribution for this type, sort of so-called Crispus type, which is overwhelmingly southeastern Suffolk as well, and just sort of the final one of the three. The iconographic similarity and distribution suggests these coins, and perhaps a few other types from the mid-7th century, were likely struck at Rendlesham, Coddenham, and possibly Hoxton in this period. And this is matched with a couple of perceptions of us. Firstly, of peripatetic kingship, with royal household moving between different elite sites, and secondly, that early medieval coinage was usually struck in centres of economic and political power. There's also ample evidence for metalworking from Rendlesham, and while there's absolutely nothing which we can tie this metalworking evidence to the coin production, the skills needed to create coinage, adjusting metal alloys, cupellation, engraving of dies, and others overlap with that of goldsmiths, who we know were working at these sites. So then, to try and summarise this mid-7th century period, from maybe the 630s or so, networks of coin circulation became gradually more regular and regionalised, with coinage increasingly coming from northeast Francia and the Low Countries. Continental currency was supplanted by coins struck in southern Suffolk, and the raw material for this East Anglian pale gold coinage can only have been the continental coinage, which made up the remainder of the circulating currency. These gold shillings were not struck at a single permanent mint site, but are likely to have been made on occasion at Rendlesham and Coddenham. The striking of coinage at these places indicates that coin production was linked with elite secular power in East Anglia, which is not the same as in other places where coins were being made at this point in time. The precise mechanisms by which continental currency was reissued as East Anglian coinage are uncertain, but given the evidence for production at elite or royal centres, it seems likely that transactions with the king or his agent were the driver. There may have been a requirement that payment to or under royal authority, taxes, rents, fines, or similar, were to be paid to the king in his own currency. And the king may have also initiated issues of coinage for distribution to others, as gifts or alms, for example. During this period, the use of coinage became progressively more common and more widespread in East Anglia, and can be seen for the first time at places and in areas other than those which were centres of the earliest coin use. So then, in the late 7th century and into the 8th, the amount of coinage in use at Rendlesham expanded dramatically. It's difficult to absolutely quantify this, but on a coins per annum basis, there were perhaps between 5 and 10 times as many coin finds in the last decades of the 7th century than there had been 50 years before. The graph on the right here hopefully gives a sense of this, with a real big jump between the mid part of the 7th century and the late part of the 7th century. The jump between that earliest period and those that follow is pretty massive. The map on the left shows the coin finds from Rendlesham, and there are a lot more of them. You have a lot more dots on this map than earlier, and the distribution reaches its maximum extent. The density of finds in the two main occupation areas here and here is pretty dense, but there's also a relatively large number of coin finds in a halo around this, including some that are quite a long way distant from those real centres of settlement down here in the south. Again, there are no clear patterns which would differentiate the types of coinage from any of these areas. It appears that there was a pool of currency used across the entirety of the site, which would support the view that this period saw a well-utilised, rapidly circulating currency. This expansion of coin use is something which has been appreciated previously, but it's worth considering nonetheless. At sites where there were a number of coins pre-670, like Coddenham and Rendlesham, there are big increases after that date, and we see a kind of fundamentally similar chronological profile for Coddenham and Rendlesham, with a relatively significant number of coins dating from pre-670, and then a big jump to the years around 700. For other sites, some of our other study sites where we thought we might see something similar, we don't get exactly the same patterns. There are sites where there are very few coins from the early to mid 7th century, including Burnham and Caister, where you have very few here. But even at those sites, you see a big increase in the years around the 7th century. The impression is of a huge expansion in the volume and velocity of coinage. In both of these places, there was a later start, but continual rises thereafter as well. We don't see the same drop-off in the 8th century as we do at Rendlesham and at Cottenham. This is also visible spatially across the landscape. This is a map that shows that coinage was quite widely dispersed across the river valley systems up the Deben and Gipping rivers. Where coin use had been constrained to only a handful of sites in the decades around 700, expanded out beyond this into new areas with no previous evidence for coin use. While I'm only showing you 2 such areas here, I could have shown you maps of the Dove Valley or the landscape around Caister, which fundamentally mirror this expansion. And at a regional level, moving from very focused use in southeast Suffolk they become much more widely dispersed coins in the years around 700. And this is also the period in time where we see significant coin use in Norfolk, which becomes increasingly important in the 8th century. The economic centre of gravity, at least as far as coin find go, begins to shift in East Anglia in the 710s and 720s. And there's better evidence for the production of coinage in Norfolk than in Suffolk in the decades around AD 700 as well. The networks of exchange continue to shift, and this bar chart on the right highlights the changing origins of coinage. So English coinage struck somewhere in England in blue, and then that struck overseas, largely in continental Francia or the Low Countries, in orange. And there's a change through time, so a gradually increasing proportion of currency from England, and really within 2 decades of its inception, within 2 generations of its inception, English coinage had become the majority coinage at Rendlesham, although there remained a significant minority of coinage from Frisia and the Rhine mouth. So in this period of 670 to 730, we see some pretty significant changes. East Anglia's interregional exchange networks were focused on the near continent and on southern England. This is reflected in a well-circulated silver coinage, which is drawn from the Low Countries and southeast England, with an increasing, if minority, component of East Anglian issues. Coin finds were much more widely spread across East Anglia than in previous periods, with Norfolk becoming steadily more prominent in the finds record. Across East Anglia, and within each of the project's study areas, the impression is of a significant growth in coin use. Areas and sites with no previous evidence for coin use produce finds indicative of their use in this period. And these have often some distance from previous centres of coin use, implying that coinage was used by more people at a greater range of places for a widening range of transactions. In the period from about 730 onwards, coinage becomes steadily more debased, with silver fineness reducing to only 10% in some cases. And this chronology matches a period of really significant change at Rendlesham. There's a shift in the distribution of coinage. So this is, we don't really see the same finds away from the river. There seems to be quite a linear distribution along the river line in the period sort of 730 to about 750-ish. And that is consistent with a wider pattern of artifact distribution, which suggests a shrinkage of the settlement area and a focus on the kind of north-south routeway. Shifting patterns of exchange can be connected with a period of significant decline in coin use at Rendlesham. While there are many coins which predate 730, there are very few that can be placed after that date. The later types that are common to much of East Anglia, particularly the late types of series or type R, are almost entirely absent from Rendlesham. And the decline that you can see in the graph on the right here, like a real peak around 700-ish, dropping down and away as you move into through the 8th century, isn't really replicated at almost any other East Anglian sites, where we'd in fact expect coins to become more common in the middle years of the 8th century. In fact, the only sites where you have similar chronological signatures are at Cottenham and at Hoxham. The decline in coin use at Rendlesham is mirrored by the chronological signature of coin finds from Ipswich. At Ipswich, there are vanishingly few coin finds that can be dated to the 7th century or indeed to early within the 8th century. Almost all of the coin finds are to be dated to the period around 730 or so, with the late types of type R dominating. The crossover point appears to be with type RSB, type R8 as sometimes known, the largest of the East Anglian coinages. These are the latest coins from Rendlesham and Codnham, and the point at which coin use takes off in a serious way at Ipswich. They were struck in Ipswich as the currency of a major trading town. And this strongly suggests to me that the monetary activity which saw an abnormally large amount of currency being used and lost at Rendlesham shifted to Ipswich in the period around 730 or so. At that moment in time, there were a series of major changes in the coinage of East Anglia. The first of these was related to production. At this point, a series of debased coinages were struck across East Anglia. These were type R and some of type Q. And their distribution, there are a number of subtypes to these with slightly different iconography that reflects different places of striking across East Anglia. These coins were struck on a scale quite unlike any other East Anglian coinage that had gone before. It was also much, much larger, and it was also struck to much lower standards of silver fineness and weight. The second change is in the use of coinage. The East Anglian type R became the dominant currency, with coinage struck outside of East Anglia being only a minority of the total circulating. And this is the first time that East Anglia had anything like an iconographically homogeneous currency circulating within it. It's worth considering the mechanisms behind this, and I would suggest that to find such a proportion of locally produced coinage would suggest that there was some form of enforced use of it, or conceivably enforced recoinage. And that would certainly be consistent with the increasing debasement of 8th century coinage, the value of which may have stemmed in part from elite guarantee rather than intrinsic metal value. If some level of recoinage of non-local types into official elite sanctioned coinage was enforced, then this has important implications for our understanding of royal power and administration. It implies an elite who wished and were able to direct elements of the production of coinage and had the capacity to enforce some degree of recoinage. The precise mechanisms are uncertain, but regulation, taxation, and tithe probably all likely played a part. The geography of coin use also shifted significantly. It is very widespread. The scale of coin use across the landscape really hits a peak between about 730 and about 750. It reflects a coinage which was both fairly common and widely used. Ipswich's regional effect was significant. In the map on the left, Rendlesham and the kind of area up the coast is the big blob at the centre of this orangey bit, whereas on the right, coin use is very much dominated by Ipswich in the southern part of Suffolk. Much of the economic activity which had previously taken place at Rendlesham and Codnham was instead happening at Ipswich instead. The specialist trading site of Ipswich emerged as they waned. The third thing to note here is that from the mid-8th century, there are many more finds from across the Norfolk landscape. As economic activity was becoming more centralised and focused on Ipswich and Suffolk, there doesn't seem to be the same process in Norfolk, where coinage appears to be more spatially dispersed right across this area from the Wash and across the north coast. And so then to try and summarise the period from 730 to about 750 or so, around 730 major shifts are apparent both in the production and use of coinage, suggesting a much more active role for a royal authority, probably during King Elfwald's reign. Than in the immediate preceding period. East Anglian coinage became the dominant currency of the kingdom. These coins had a defined iconography that differentiated them from other coinages in England. They were struck using a debased metal standards, and it seems possible that their value was guaranteed by their issuer rather than the intrinsic bullion value. The pool of currency circulating with East Anglia became dominated by these locally struck coinages, with those from other parts of England and the Low Countries making up only a minority component. These debased coinages of this period are found widely across East Anglia. In Norfolk, their distribution is quite widespread. In Suffolk, the emergence of Ipswich as a major commercial centre coincided with a realignment in the distribution of coins. Monetary activity at Rendlesham and Codnham dwindled as activity at Ipswich expanded. Okay then, returning to where we started, and how do I draw this together? The first of these questions then, in the early part of our period until about 670 or so, Rendlesham was highly unusual. It was the only site, the only site which is really comparable to it is Coddenham. It was at the very apex of the early medieval economy and society with significance on an international scale. From the late 7th century, it becomes more like everywhere else, until in the 8th century its monetary importance wanes entirely, in preference for economic activity at Ipswich. For question 2, the networks of exchange were extensive. The small number of early coin finds found at only a small number of East Anglian sites indicate long-distance exchange contacts and ultimately connections with the Mediterranean world. The main axes of these networks shift, initially to Francia in the early 7th century and then to the Low Countries in the mid-7th century. Exchange contacts with other areas of England become increasingly evident in the coin finds of the 7th and 8th centuries. And the early contacts with the coin-using areas in Europe are likely to have played a part in encouraging the use of coinage for exchange at Rendlesham and Coddenham. The early date of, onto the third question then, the early date of coin use at Rendlesham places it in the vanguard of coin use in East Anglia and indeed across England. Access to coinage from Byzantium and Francia is crucial to explaining the beginnings of coin use at Rendlesham. Rendlesham's coin find should be seen within the context of other continental and Mediterranean high-status metalwork from the site as a product of long-distance social and exchange contacts. I think that it's likely that coinage was initially used primarily at elite or royal sites by those engaging in transaction with members of the ruling elite and their agents. The striking of coinage in the mid-7th century may have been prompted by a concern to exploit and formalize control of such actions through a requirement they be paid in the king's own coinage. Coin use expanded thereafter to enable monetary transactions between other actors in economic spheres independent of royal authority, between other members of the elite in the mid-7th century and an ever greater range of people from the late 7th century onwards. As a general model, the evidence suggests that coinage was primarily used at centres such as Rendlesham, perhaps for public exchange involving or connected with elites, before gradually expanding to other spaces and involving other people in private exchange. The influence of Rendlesham is most clear in the early period and gradually less visible as coinage becomes more distant spatially in later periods. At that point, I'll be quiet and say thank you very much for listening. If you want to read more or to hear about other aspects of this project, the book will be out later this year. It's called Landscape and Lordship, published by the Society of Antiquaries, and I would encourage you all to check it out. Thank you very much.